This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. In the heart of Texas, where barbecue isn't just food, but a sacred tradition passed down through generations, pride runs as deep as the smoky flavors that define a pitmaster's legacy. The year 1996 found Houston in the midst of cultural transformation, a city balancing its oil-rich heritage with rapid modernization, where old-school establishments stood defiantly against the creeping influence of chain restaurants and corporate culture. This is the story of one man's obsession with perfection, a community's unwavering loyalty to tradition, and a single night that would forever change how a neighborhood understood the thin line between passion and madness. Through interviews with survivors, family members, investigators, and community leaders, we piece together the psychological portrait of a tragedy that began not with violence, but with years of accumulated pressure, unrecognized warning signs, and the devastating consequences of wounded pride in a culture where respect is earned one plate at a time. What follows is an investigation into the human condition, exploring how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when filtered through personal trauma, cultural identity, and the dangerous intersection of tradition and mental instability. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The 6th Ward's barbecue trail stretched along Lyons Avenue like a smoky pilgrimage route, each joint marked by towering brick chimneys that painted the Houston sky with ribbons of oak and hickory. In 1996, before gentrification would later transform this historically African-American neighborhood, the area pulsed with authentic Texas barbecue culture that had evolved over decades of family recipes, community gatherings, and fierce territorial pride among pitmasters who viewed their craft as both art and inheritance. Samuel Big Sam Washington had operated Sam's Smoke Pit for 12 years, from a converted gas station on the corner of Lyons and Lockwood, where faded Texaco signs still ghosted the brick walls and oil stains marked the concrete where pumps once stood. At 43, Sam commanded respect throughout the ward. A towering man whose massive hands could gentle a brisket through 16 hours of slow smoking, while his deep voice carried stories that stretched back to his grandfather's recipes from East Texas cotton country. Sam was larger than life in every way, recalls Martha Coleman, a regular customer who worked at the nearby 5th Ward Community Center. When you walked into that place, the smell hit you like a warm hug, and Sam would always greet you by name. He remembered how everyone liked their meat, lean or fatty, sauce on the side or slathered thick. That attention to detail wasn't just customer service, it was his identity. The restaurant occupied a cramped space with mismatched tables, hand-painted signs advertising daily specials, and walls decorated with faded photographs of Sam with local politicians, church leaders, and satisfied customers holding plates piled high with beef ribs and hot links. The real heart of the operation lay behind the building, in a custom-built smoking chamber that Sam had constructed himself, a massive steel and brick structure where he could smoke up to 20 briskets simultaneously, maintaining precise temperature control through a complex system of vents and dampers that he adjusted by instinct developed over years of practice. But the true secret of Sam's success wasn't his smoking technique or his tender meats. It was his sauce. The recipe had been handed down from his grandfather, Ezekiel Washington, who had moved from Marshall, Texas to Houston in 1954 during the Great Migration, carrying with him a molasses-based barbecue sauce that combined traditional East Texas sweetness with a complex blend of spices that Sam never fully revealed to anyone, including his own family. That sauce was Sam's calling card, explains Detective Raymond Torres, who worked the 5th Ward beat in the mid-1990s and frequently ate at Sam's during his patrol shifts. People would drive from all over Houston just to taste it. Some folks claimed it had healing properties, others said it was addictive. Sam took that recipe seriously. He mixed it himself every morning before dawn, and nobody was allowed in that kitchen when he was working on it. The sauce represented more than flavoring to Sam. It embodied his connection to family history his mastery of barbecue craft, and his standing in a community where reputation was built one satisfied customer at a time. Local food writers had attempted to analyze and replicate the recipe, but Sam's sauce remained uniquely his own, a source of pride that elevated his modest restaurant above competitors throughout Houston's competitive barbecue scene. The Washington family's barbecue legacy traced back to Ezekiel's childhood in East Texas during the 1920s, where he learned smoking techniques from his father, Moses Washington, a sharecropper who supplemented his meager cotton earnings by cooking for church gatherings and harvest celebrations. The sauce recipe originated during those lean Depression years when Moses experimented with available ingredients: sorghum molasses from local farms, wild peppers growing along creek beds, and spices bartered from traveling merchants who traded throughout rural Texas. "My grandfather used to tell me that barbecue was our family's contribution to American culture," Sam often explained to customers who asked about his cooking heritage. "While other folks were struggling just to survive, we were creating something that brought joy to people's lives." That sauce recipe represents 5 generations of African-American ingenuity, taking whatever was available and transforming it into something special. When Ezekiel migrated to Houston in 1954, he initially worked construction jobs while cooking barbecue on weekends for church functions and neighborhood gatherings. The sauce recipe evolved during this period as he adapted to urban ingredients and customer preferences, adding commercial spices that weren't available in rural East Texas while maintaining the molasses base that provided the sauce's distinctive sweet, tangy character. Sam's father, Robert Washington, inherited both the recipe and his father's dedication to barbecue excellence, operating a small catering business from their family home throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Robert taught Sam the fundamentals of smoking meat, sauce preparation, and customer service, emphasizing that barbecue wasn't just food, but a cultural tradition that connected families and communities across generations. "My daddy always said that when you serve someone barbecue, you're not just feeding their body, you're nourishing their soul," Sam would explain to new employees. "That's why every detail matters. From the wood selection to the sauce consistency to the way you greet customers. People don't just come here to eat, they come here to connect with something authentic and meaningful." By spring 1996, however, subtle changes had begun appearing in Sam's behavior that concerned longtime customers and neighbors. His usual jovial demeanor occasionally gave way to intense focus that bordered on obsession. He started arriving at the restaurant earlier each morning, sometimes before 3 a.m., to begin preparation rituals that had previously required less time. Staff members noticed that he became increasingly particular about temperature control, sauce consistency, and customer service details that he had once handled with relaxed confidence. Sam was always a perfectionist, but that spring he seemed wound tighter than usual, remembers Janet Morris, who worked as Sam's cashier for 3 years. He would spend an hour adjusting the smoker temperature by just a few degrees, or remake an entire batch of sauce if he thought the consistency wasn't exactly right. When customers complimented his food, he seemed almost suspicious, like he was waiting for criticism instead of enjoying the praise. The changes in Sam's behavior coincided with several external pressures that were transforming Houston's barbecue landscape during the mid-1990s. Corporate restaurant chains had begun expanding into traditionally independent barbecue markets, offering standardized products and aggressive pricing that threatened smaller establishments. Additionally, the Fifth Ward was experiencing demographic shifts as property values rose, and longtime residents faced displacement pressure from development projects. Sam was feeling squeezed from all directions, explains Dr. Patricia Williams, a community psychologist who studied Fifth Ward social dynamics during the 1990s. The neighborhood was changing, competition was increasing, and he was carrying the weight of family tradition while trying to maintain a business in an evolving market. For someone whose identity was so deeply connected to his craft and community standing, these pressures could feel overwhelming. The pressure intensified when Houston Chronicle food critic Michael Chen announced plans to review Fifth Ward barbecue establishments as part of a series exploring authentic Texas barbecue culture beyond the well-known downtown restaurants. For weeks, Sam prepared obsessively for the potential visit, perfecting recipes, cleaning equipment until it gleamed, and practicing service routines with his small staff until every detail met his exacting standards. Local barbecue competition had always existed among Fifth Ward establishments, but the prospect of citywide media attention elevated the stakes significantly. Sam understood that a favorable Chronicle review could transform his business overnight, bringing suburban customers and tourist traffic that would ensure financial security. Conversely, a negative review or being overlooked entirely could damage his reputation and accelerate the decline he feared was already beginning. Sam talked about that Chronicle review like it was going to determine the rest of his life, recalls James Peterson, who operated a competing barbecue restaurant 2 blocks away on Lyons Avenue. He was convinced that this was his one chance to prove that authentic Fifth Ward barbecue was superior to those fancy downtown places with their expensive marketing and celebrity chef nonsense. He saw it as defending not just his own reputation, but the entire neighborhood's barbecue tradition. The anticipated review never materialized during the spring months, but the preparation period had taken a psychological toll on Sam that manifested in increased irritability towards staff, customers who asked questions about his cooking methods, and especially anyone who offered suggestions about his food. Regular customers learned to avoid commenting on preparation techniques or ingredient choices that might trigger defensive responses from a man whose identity had become increasingly fused with his culinary reputation. Sam's wife, Dorothy, noticed the changes most acutely during their home life, as he became increasingly preoccupied with restaurant operations and less engaged with family activities. Their 2 teenage children, Marcus and Keisha, began spending more time with friends rather than helping at the restaurant, as they had done throughout their childhood, sensing their father's mounting tension and unpredictable mood swings. Sam started taking everything personally, Dorothy later explained to investigators. If a customer didn't finish their plate, he would wonder what was wrong with the food instead of considering that maybe they just weren't that hungry. If someone ordered sauce on the side, instead of having it applied in the kitchen, he would interpret that as criticism of his sauce recipe rather than just personal preference. Warning signs accumulated throughout the early summer of 1996, though few people recognized them as symptoms of mounting psychological pressure. Sam began working longer hours, often staying at the restaurant past midnight to clean equipment and prepare for the following day. His sleep patterns became erratic, as he frequently woke during the night to write notes about sauce recipes and smoking techniques, as if trying to capture perfect formulations that existed just beyond his reach. The physical demands of operating a barbecue restaurant during Houston's brutal summer months added another layer of stress to Sam's deteriorating mental state. Temperatures inside the smoking area regularly exceeded 110 degrees, and the constant monitoring required to maintain proper cooking conditions created a punishing schedule that left little time for rest or relaxation. Sam was pushing himself beyond normal limits, remembers Dr. Eugene Parker, the family physician who had treated the Washington family for over a decade. When Dorothy brought him in for a routine checkup that July, his blood pressure was elevated. He had lost weight despite being around food all day, and he showed signs of chronic fatigue. I recommended stress reduction techniques and suggested he consider taking on additional help at the restaurant, but Sam insisted he could handle everything himself. The warning signs became more pronounced as summer progressed into the sweltering heat of July and August, when Houston's humidity turned outdoor cooking into an endurance test that challenged even experienced pitmasters. Sam's smoking sessions extended longer as he pursued increasingly precise temperature and timing standards that existed mainly in his own mind, creating perfectionist expectations that no cooking process could consistently satisfy. Regular customers began noticing changes in Sam's interaction style. Responses to questions became shorter and more defensive. Compliments received lukewarm acknowledgement rather than his characteristic warm appreciation, and any suggestion for improvement, however well-intentioned, triggered visible tension that made conversations uncomfortable. The man who had once thrived on customer feedback and community connection was gradually isolating himself behind walls of suspicion and defensive pride. You could see it in his eyes by late summer, observes Reverend Charles Mitchell, pastor of Mount Olive Baptist Church, where Sam had been a member for 15 years. The joy was draining out of him day by day. When I visited the restaurant to order food for church events, Sam would barely make eye contact. He was there in body, but his spirit was somewhere else, wrestling with demons that none of us could see or understand. The stage was being set for a confrontation that nobody could have predicted, as Sam's psychological pressure reached levels that transformed normal customer interactions into potential threats to the identity and reputation he had spent 12 years building, one perfectly smoked brisket at a time. The man who had once embodied the welcoming spirit of Fifth Ward barbecue culture was becoming a prisoner of his own impossible standards, trapped in a cycle of perfectionist anxiety that would ultimately lead to consequences far beyond anything his family, friends, or community could have imagined. August in Houston arrived like a fever dream, with temperatures soaring above 100 degrees and humidity levels that turned the air itself into a suffocating weight pressing down on the city. For barbecue pitmasters like Sam Washington, the brutal heat created working conditions that pushed both equipment and human endurance to their absolute limits. The massive steel smoking chambers behind Sam's smoke pit radiated additional heat that transformed the restaurant's outdoor prep area into what employees privately called the furnace zone. By early August 1996, Sam's behavior had evolved from merely perfectionist to genuinely concerning. He now arrived at the restaurant by 2:30 a.m. each morning, a full hour earlier than his previous routine, to begin preparation rituals that had expanded into elaborate ceremonies of temperature checking, sauce tasting, and equipment inspection that consumed increasing amounts of time while producing diminishing returns in actual food quality improvement. Sam was treating that restaurant like it was mission control for a space launch, recalls Tommy Rodriguez, a delivery driver who supplied Sam with oak wood and specialty spices twice weekly. Every morning when I arrived around 6 a.m., I would find him hunched over thermometers and clipboards, recording temperature readings and timing data like he was conducting scientific experiments. The man was documenting everything: how many degrees the smoke had dropped when he opened the chamber door, how long it took sauce to reach perfect consistency, even how many customers commented positively versus negatively on different aspects of their meals. The documentation obsession reflected Sam's growing conviction that barbecue excellence could be achieved through absolute precision rather than the intuitive cooking methods he had previously relied upon. His grandfather's casual approach to sauce mixing, a splash of this, a handful of that until it tastes right, had been replaced by measurements recorded to the quarter teaspoon, timing sequences calculated to the minute, and quality standards that no human cooking process could consistently meet. Dorothy Washington watched her husband's transformation with mounting alarm as his personality shifted from warm community leader to isolated perfectionist who viewed every interaction as potential criticism of his life's work. Family dinners became tense affairs where Sam would analyze their home-cooked meals with the same critical intensity he applied to restaurant operations, identifying minor flaws in seasoning or cooking technique that would have been imperceptible to normal palates. Sam started looking at food like a detective examining crime scene evidence, Dorothy later explained to counselors. He would dissect every bite, analyzing flavors and textures, comparing everything to some impossible standard that existed only in his mind. When I cooked his favorite Sunday pot roast, instead of enjoying it, he would critique the browning technique or suggest modifications to the seasoning blend. The man who used to find joy in every aspect of cooking had turned food into a source of constant anxiety. The psychological pressure intensified when competing barbecue establishments throughout Houston began modernizing their operations with new equipment, expanded menus and marketing strategies designed to attract younger customers who might not appreciate traditional barbecue culture. Sam interpreted these developments as direct threats to his restaurant's survival, viewing every innovation by competitors as evidence that his traditional approach was becoming obsolete. Jameson's BBQ Palace, a newer establishment that had opened in the nearby Third Ward, represented everything Sam feared about barbecue's commercial evolution. Owner Marcus Jameson had invested in computerized smoking systems that maintained precise temperature control automatically, eliminating the constant monitoring that traditional pitmasters considered essential to their craft. The restaurant featured modern decor, efficient service systems, and a diverse menu that included non-traditional items like barbecue pizza and smoked salmon. Marcus was bringing barbecue into the modern age, and that terrified Sam, explains food industry consultant Angela Davis, who worked with several Houston restaurants during the 1990s. Sam saw computerized equipment and standardized processes as threats to authentic barbecue culture, but customers were responding positively to the consistency and convenience that modern operations provided. Sam was caught between maintaining tradition and adapting to changing market demands, and that internal conflict was eating him alive. The pressure reached a breaking point during the third week of August, when local food blogger Jennifer Chen, no relation to the Chronicle critic, published an online review comparing Fifth Ward barbecue establishments. Her assessment of Sam's smoke pit was generally positive, praising the authentic atmosphere and traditional smoking techniques, but she noted that sauce consistency varied between visits and suggested that the restaurant could benefit from more reliable quality control procedures. Sam's reaction to the review revealed the depth of his psychological deterioration. Rather than acknowledging the constructive feedback, he interpreted Chen's comments as personal attacks on his family's barbecue legacy and his competence as a pitmaster. He spent hours analyzing every phrase in the review, searching for hidden criticisms and implied insults that existed primarily in his increasingly paranoid imagination. Sam called me at home after reading that review, and I barely recognized his voice, remembers Janet Morris, his longtime cashier. He was speaking rapidly, jumping between topics, asking me if I had noticed sauce consistency problems or if customers had made comments about quality issues. When I assured him that customers consistently praised his food, he accused me of lying to protect his feelings. The man was spiraling into a place where he couldn't accept positive feedback and interpreted everything as evidence of failure. Staff members began walking on eggshells around Sam as his mood swings became increasingly unpredictable. Morning briefings that had once been collaborative planning sessions transformed into tense interrogations where Sam questioned employees about customer comments, cooking procedures, and potential quality issues. His paranoia extended to suspicions that competitors were sending spies to observe his cooking techniques, or that food critics were visiting anonymously to gather information for negative reviews. The mounting psychological pressure manifested in physical symptoms that became impossible to ignore. Sam's weight loss accelerated, despite his constant exposure to food. His hands developed a persistent tremor that made precise sauce measurements difficult, and his sleep deprivation created cognitive fog that interfered with decision-making processes he had previously handled automatically. Sam was running on fumes and nervous energy, observes Dr. Patricia Williams, the community psychologist. His identity had become so completely fused with his restaurant's success that he couldn't separate personal worth from professional performance. Every day brought new challenges to his perfectionist standards, creating a feedback loop where increased effort produced diminishing returns while amplifying his anxiety about failure. The crisis deepened when Sam's longtime supplier of premium beef brisket informed him that prices would increase by 15% due to market conditions affecting the entire Texas cattle industry. For most restaurant owners, this would have been a routine business challenge requiring menu price adjustments or supplier negotiations. For Sam, it represented another threat to the perfect barbecue experience he was desperately trying to maintain while operating under impossible financial constraints. Sam took that price increase personally, like the supplier was deliberately trying to sabotage his restaurant, recalls supplier representative David Martinez. He spent an hour on the phone questioning whether the price increase was industry-wide or specifically targeting his business. When I provided documentation showing similar increases for all our clients, he suggested that larger restaurants were receiving preferential pricing that put small operations like his at an unfair disadvantage. Rather than adjusting his menu prices to accommodate increased costs, Sam decided to absorb the additional expense while maintaining his current pricing structure. This decision created financial pressure that compounded his existing stress, while demonstrating his unwillingness to compromise on any aspect of the customer experience, even when economic reality demanded practical adjustments. The financial strain coincided with the beginning of the school year, when many of Sam's regular lunch customers, teachers, school administrators, and parents reduced their restaurant visits due to busier schedules and tighter budgets. The seasonal decline in business, which Sam had experienced every September for 12 years, suddenly felt like evidence of declining food quality or customer satisfaction rather than predictable cyclical patterns. September was always slower for lunch business, but Sam convinced himself that customers were abandoning his restaurant because of quality problems, explains longtime customer William Jackson, who worked at a nearby elementary school. When I explained that teachers simply had less flexibility for restaurant lunches during the school year, Sam asked detailed questions about whether food quality had influenced my reduced visits. He was looking for problems that didn't exist and interpreting normal business fluctuations as personal failures. The paranoia intensified when Sam noticed that some regular customers were visiting less frequently or ordering different items than their usual preferences. Rather than considering normal explanations, dietary changes, financial constraints, or simple variety seeking, he interpreted every deviation from established patterns as evidence that his food quality was declining or that customers were dissatisfied with his service. Customer interactions became increasingly strained as Sam began monitoring conversations and reactions with uncomfortable intensity. Diners who had previously enjoyed casual conversations with the friendly proprietor found themselves subjected to detailed questioning about food quality, service satisfaction, and comparisons with competing restaurants. Sam started making people nervous with his questions, remembers regular customer Lisa Thompson. Instead of the relaxed conversation we used to have, he would interrogate me about every aspect of my meal. Was the meat tender enough? Was the sauce the right consistency? Did anything taste different from previous visits? When I assured him everything was excellent, he would press for more specific feedback, like he was convinced I was hiding criticism to spare his feelings. The questioning extended to requests for detailed comparisons with other barbecue restaurants throughout Houston. Sam wanted to know which establishments customers had visited recently, how his food compared to competitors, and whether they had noticed any quality improvements or declines over time. These conversations created uncomfortable situations where customers felt obligated to provide reassurance rather than enjoying their dining experience. Family relationships deteriorated as Sam's obsession consumed increasing amounts of time and emotional energy that had previously been devoted to his wife and children. Dorothy found herself managing household responsibilities alone while providing constant emotional support to a husband who could no longer find satisfaction in achievements that had once brought him joy. Sam was physically present but emotionally absent, Dorothy later explained. When he came home after 16-hour days at the restaurant, he would spend hours reviewing his notes, analyzing customer comments, and planning modifications to recipes that were already perfect. Our conversations became dominated by restaurant problems that he couldn't stop thinking about long enough to connect with his family. Their teenage children, Marcus and Keisha, began avoiding the restaurant entirely rather than witnessing their father's psychological deterioration. The family business that had once brought them together now represented a source of stress that threatened their home stability and their father's mental health. The situation reached a critical point during the final week of August when Sam decided that his sauce recipe required fundamental modifications to achieve the perfection that seemed increasingly elusive. Despite 12 years of customer satisfaction and consistent praise for his sauce, he convinced himself that subtle improvements were necessary to maintain competitive advantage against modernizing competitors. Sam started experimenting with his grandfather's recipe like he was trying to reinvent barbecue sauce from scratch, recalls supply manager Rodriguez. He ordered exotic spices, premium molasses, and specialty vinegars that had never been part of the original formulation. When I asked about the changes, he explained that he was optimizing the flavor profile to meet contemporary palate preferences. That wasn't the Sam Washington I had known for years. The recipe modifications created additional stress as Sam struggled to balance respect for family tradition with his compulsive need for improvement. Each experimental batch required extensive testing documentation, and comparison with the original formulation, consuming time and mental energy while producing results that satisfied no one, least of all, Sam himself. As August drew to a close, Sam Washington had transformed from a beloved community figure into an isolated perfectionist whose pursuit of impossible standards was destroying the very foundations of success he was desperately trying to preserve. The stage was set for confrontations that would test every relationship he had built over 12 years of serving authentic barbecue to a community that had embraced him as family, but no longer recognized the man their friend and neighbor had become. The first weekend of September 1996 arrived with the oppressive heat that marked Houston's final stand against autumn, when the sun seemed to press down with personal malice against anyone foolish enough to spend hours tending outdoor fires. Sam Washington had been awake since 1:45 a.m., nearly an hour earlier than even his recent obsessive schedule demanded, standing in the pre-dawn darkness behind his restaurant like a sentry guarding secrets that only he could understand. His latest sauce experiment sat in carefully labeled mason jars, arranged across a makeshift laboratory he had constructed from folding tables and camping equipment. Each jar contained a slight variation of his grandfather's recipe, modified acidity levels, adjusted spice ratios, alternative sweetener combinations, representing Sam's desperate attempt to achieve a perfection that existed only in his increasingly fractured imagination. I started finding Sam back there before sunrise most mornings, hunched over those jars like some kind of mad scientist, recalls night security guard Robert Hayes, whose patrol route included the restaurants along Lyons Avenue. He had notebooks filled with detailed measurements, timing charts, and customer reaction data. The man was treating barbecue sauce like it was nuclear physics, trying to calculate the exact formula for happiness in every bottle. The experimental phase had consumed 3 weeks of preparation time that would normally have been devoted to actual restaurant operations. Sam's perfectionist testing procedures required preparing small batches of each variation, aging them for precise time intervals, and conducting taste comparisons under controlled conditions that bore no resemblance to the casual sauce application methods his family had used for generations. Dorothy Washington watched her husband's descent into recipe obsession with growing alarm, recognizing that his compulsive experimentation represented something far more dangerous than simple dedication to craft improvement. The man who had once prepared sauce by intuition and inherited wisdom now spent hours calculating ratios and recording data that would have been meaningless to the grandfather whose legacy he claimed to be honoring. Sam was trying to turn art into science, and it was destroying both, Dorothy later explained to family counselors. His grandfather never measured anything precisely. He cooked by smell, taste, and instinct developed over decades of experience. But Sam had convinced himself that emotional cooking methods were unreliable, that only mathematical precision could produce consistently perfect results. He was losing the very soul of what made his barbecue special. The weekend testing session had been planned as the final evaluation before implementing his optimized sauce recipe for regular customer service. Sam had invited his most trusted regular customers to participate in a blind taste comparison, presenting the evaluation as an opportunity for community input rather than revealing the desperate internal crisis that motivated his recipe modifications. James Peterson arrived that Saturday morning expecting to enjoy his usual weekend brisket plate and friendly conversation with a neighbor whose restaurant had become a community gathering place. Instead, he found Sam arranging sauce samples with the intensity of someone conducting life-or-death medical research, complete with numbered cups, scoring sheets, and detailed instructions for providing feedback. Sam had lost all perspective about what he was doing, Peterson later recalled. He handed me these little cups of sauce like they contained precious medicine, explaining elaborate tasting procedures and asking me to rate different flavor components on numerical scales. When I suggested that maybe he was overthinking things, that his regular sauce was already perfect, he looked at me like I had insulted his entire family heritage. The taste testing session revealed the depth of Sam's psychological deterioration as he interpreted neutral customer feedback as evidence of failure and positive comments as insincere politeness designed to protect his feelings. When longtime customer Martha Coleman praised the complexity of his experimental variations While expressing preference for the original recipe, Sam questioned her extensively about specific deficiencies she perceived in the modified versions. Sam was looking for problems that didn't exist and couldn't accept that people genuinely loved his original sauce. Coleman later explained to investigators, "When I told him his grandfather's recipe was already perfect, he started asking whether I thought perfect was good enough to compete with modern barbecue establishments, whether traditional methods could satisfy contemporary palate expectations, and whether I was being honest about my preferences or just trying to spare his feelings." The questioning continued for over an hour, as Sam pressed each participant for detailed analysis of flavor profiles, consistency evaluations, and comparative assessments against other barbecue sauces throughout Houston. Customers who had arrived expecting casual weekend dining found themselves subjected to intensive interrogations that transformed social visits into uncomfortable focus group sessions. The breaking point came when customer Michael Torres made what he intended as a light-hearted suggestion that Sam consider offering multiple sauce options to accommodate different taste preferences. Torres had noticed that some barbecue restaurants provided mild, medium, and hot sauce variations, and he casually mentioned that variety might appeal to customers with different heat tolerances. Sam's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. His face flushed with anger as he interpreted Torres's suggestion as criticism of his singular sauce recipe and evidence that customers found his offerings inadequate. Rather than engaging in normal conversation about menu options, Sam launched into a defensive explanation of why his family recipe represented the perfect balance of flavors that couldn't be improved through variations or modifications. "I was just making casual conversation, suggesting that maybe some people like things spicier or milder," Torres later told police investigators. But Sam took it like I was attacking his entire life's work. He started explaining why his grandfather's recipe was scientifically superior to anything other restaurants were serving, how years of customer satisfaction proved that variations were unnecessary, and how suggesting modifications showed that I didn't understand authentic barbecue culture. The confrontation escalated when Sam began questioning Torres about his barbecue knowledge and experience, demanding to know which restaurants he had visited recently and how he qualified to make suggestions about sauce recipes. Other customers watched uncomfortably as their weekend gathering transformed into a heated argument about barbecue authenticity and recipe modification philosophy. Sam was treating Mike like he was some kind of barbecue spy sent by competitors to steal trade secrets, recalls witness Janet Morris. When Mike tried to defuse the situation by saying he was just making conversation, Sam accused him of being dishonest about his real motivations. The man had completely lost touch with normal social interaction. He was seeing enemies and threats everywhere. The argument continued for nearly 30 minutes as Sam defended his sauce recipe with increasingly aggressive language, while Torres attempted to explain that he was simply making friendly conversation rather than serious culinary criticism. Other customers began leaving rather than witnessing the uncomfortable confrontation that bore no resemblance to the welcoming atmosphere Sam's restaurant had maintained for 12 years. Dorothy arrived at the restaurant during the height of the argument, immediately recognizing that her husband's behavior had crossed into dangerous territory that threatened both his mental health and the business they had built together. Her attempts to defuse the situation by suggesting that Torres was simply offering friendly input were met with accusations that she was undermining his professional competence in front of customers. "I had never seen Sam treat customers with anything but respect and appreciation," Dorothy later testified. But that morning, he was arguing with Mike Torres like they were enemies instead of neighbors who had known each other for years. "When I tried to calm him down, Sam accused me of taking sides against him and not understanding the pressure he was facing to maintain quality standards in an increasingly competitive market." The confrontation finally ended when Torres left the restaurant rather than continue arguing with someone who had clearly lost perspective about the significance of casual conversation. His departure was followed by other customers who no longer felt comfortable in an establishment where friendly suggestions could trigger explosive defensive reactions from the owner. Sam's behavior throughout the remainder of that weekend continued to deteriorate as he interpreted customer departures as evidence that his reputation had been damaged beyond repair by Torres's suggestions about sauce variations. Rather than recognizing that his own aggressive response had created the uncomfortable situation, he convinced himself that outside criticism was undermining customer confidence in his barbecue quality. Sam spent the rest of that weekend obsessing about the conversation with Mike Torres, analyzing every word and looking for hidden meanings, Dorothy recalled. He was convinced that Mike was spreading negative comments about the restaurant throughout the neighborhood, that customers were questioning his sauce recipe, and that his reputation was being systematically destroyed by people who didn't understand authentic barbecue culture. The paranoia extended to surveillance activities as Sam began monitoring customer conversations more intensively, looking for evidence that Torres or other critics were influencing community opinion about his restaurant. He started positioning himself within listening range of dining tables, pretending to clean equipment, while actually eavesdropping on conversations that might contain references to his food quality or service standards. Sam was acting like customers were enemy agents conducting intelligence operations against his restaurant, observed security guard Hayes. I would see him lurking around dining tables, pretending to arrange condiment bottles while obviously listening to private conversations. When customers lowered their voices or changed subjects after noticing his presence, he interpreted that as evidence they were discussing negative assessments of his food. The weekend's events marked a significant escalation in Sam's psychological deterioration, transforming him from a perfectionist restaurant owner into someone who viewed normal customer interactions as potential threats to his identity and livelihood. The community gathering place that had once welcomed diverse opinions and friendly conversation was becoming a fortress where the proprietor defended his reputation against perceived attacks from neighbors who had previously been considered friends. Local community leaders began receiving reports about Sam's increasingly aggressive behavior toward customers who offered suggestions or asked questions about his cooking methods. Reverend Charles Mitchell attempted to visit the restaurant for a pastoral conversation about stress management, but Sam interpreted the visit as evidence that community members were discussing his mental state rather than simply expressing concern for his well-being. Sam was isolating himself from everyone who tried to help, Mitchell later explained. When I suggested that maybe he was working too hard and could benefit from taking some time to rest and pray, he accused me of believing gossip about his restaurant and not understanding the pressures facing small business owners. The man was so defensive that he couldn't accept support from people who genuinely cared about his welfare. The isolation deepened as Sam's paranoid interpretation of customer interactions created a hostile environment that drove away long-time supporters who had sustained his business for over a decade. Regular customers who had once enjoyed casual conversation with their neighborhood pitmaster now limited their visits to quick takeout orders that avoided prolonged interaction with someone whose mood had become dangerously unpredictable. By the middle of September, Sam Washington had transformed from a beloved community figure into an isolated individual whose pursuit of impossible perfection had destroyed the very relationships that had made his restaurant successful. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would test every remaining connection between a troubled man and the community that no longer recognized the person he had become, but still hoped to find some way to reach the friend and neighbor they remembered before his descent into paranoid obsession consumed everything he had spent 12 years building. Employee turnover accelerated as staff members found working conditions increasingly stressful under Sam's obsessive management style and unpredictable emotional reactions. The casual family atmosphere that had characterized the restaurant's early years had been replaced by a tense environment where every interaction carried the potential for triggering defensive outbursts about food quality, customer satisfaction, or competitive threats. Nobody wanted to work for Sam anymore, explains former employee Marcus Johnson, who quit after 3 years of steady employment. Every shift was like walking through a minefield. You never knew what innocent comment or normal question might set him off on a rant about sauce recipes or customer loyalty. The man was exhausting to be around, and it wasn't fair to expect employees to manage his emotional problems while trying to serve food. The staffing difficulties created operational challenges that further compromised Sam's ability to maintain the quality standards he was desperately trying to preserve. Inexperienced replacement workers required extensive training on procedures that Sam had developed into elaborate rituals, consuming time and energy while producing results that rarely met his impossibly precise expectations. As September progressed toward what would become a tragic conclusion, Sam Washington stood alone in his restaurant empire of one, surrounded by empty tables and silent equipment, convinced that he was defending authentic barbecue culture against forces that existed primarily in his fractured imagination, while the community he had once served with joy and pride watched helplessly as their beloved neighbor disappeared into a darkness that no amount of perfect sauce or precisely smoked brisket could illuminate. The evening of September 23, 1996, began like countless others at Sam's smoke pit, with the familiar ritual of closing preparations that had become Sam Washington's final anchor to the routine that had once brought him satisfaction. The autumn air carried the first hint of relief from Houston's brutal summer heat, and the dining room held only 3 tables of customers finishing their meals under the warm glow of mismatched lamps that Sam had collected over 12 years of operation. Detective Raymond Torres later reconstructed the timeline of that evening through extensive interviews with survivors, witnesses, and emergency responders, piecing together a sequence of events that transformed an ordinary Monday night into a tragedy that would haunt the Fifth Ward community for generations. The investigation revealed how months of mounting psychological pressure had created conditions where a single moment of perceived disrespect could trigger consequences that no one could have anticipated or prevented. Monday nights were usually quiet, recalls survivor Patricia Jenkins, who was dining with her husband Robert when the evening's events began to unfold. Sam seemed more relaxed than he had been in recent weeks. He was moving between tables, checking on customers, making small talk about the weather and local news. For a few minutes, it felt like the old Sam was back, the friendly neighborhood pitmaster we had known for so many years. The illusion of normalcy was maintained throughout the early evening as Sam interacted with customers using social skills that had temporarily emerged from beneath layers of paranoid anxiety. He discussed barbecue techniques with genuine enthusiasm, accepted compliments about his food with appropriate gratitude, and even laughed at light-hearted jokes about Houston's weather and local sports teams. Janet Morris, working her final shift before leaving for a better job opportunity, later testified about Sam's apparent mood improvement during the early evening hours. "I was actually feeling hopeful that maybe Sam was getting better, that whatever had been bothering him for months was finally starting to resolve itself. He was acting like the boss I remembered from my early years working here, friendly, confident, genuinely interested in making sure customers had a good experience." The first indication that Sam's improved demeanor was superficial rather than genuine came when customer Derek Williams asked about the possibility of ordering sauce on the side rather than having it applied in the kitchen. Williams suffered from a medical condition that required him to monitor sodium intake carefully, and he hoped to control the amount of sauce consumed by applying it himself rather than relying on kitchen portions. Sam's initial response was measured and professional, explaining that his sauce application technique ensured optimal flavor distribution across the meat surface and that customer self-application might result in uneven coverage that would diminish the overall dining experience. Williams acknowledged the explanation while politely insisting that his medical needs required portion control that was easier to achieve with side-served sauce. Derek was being completely reasonable about his request, recalls his dining companion Lisa Chang. He explained about his health condition, complimented Sam's sauce recipe, and simply asked for accommodation that would allow him to enjoy the food while managing his dietary requirements. It was the kind of special request that restaurants handle routinely, without any difficulty. The conversation continued for several minutes, as Sam attempted to persuade Williams that kitchen-applied sauce would provide superior flavor integration, while Williams maintained that his health needs required self-application control. The exchange remained civil throughout this initial phase, with both men presenting their positions respectfully while seeking a mutually acceptable compromise. The turning point came when Williams mentioned that other barbecue restaurants throughout Houston routinely accommodated sauce-on-the-side requests without compromising food quality or customer satisfaction. His comment was intended as reassurance that his request was reasonable rather than criticism of Sam's standard service procedures. But Sam interpreted the comparison as evidence that Williams was questioning his professional competence based on experiences at competing establishments. Sam's entire demeanor changed when Derek mentioned other restaurants, Chang later testified. His voice got quieter and more intense, and he started asking detailed questions about which establishments Derek had visited recently, how their sauce compared to Sam's recipe, and whether he preferred their service methods to the traditional approach that Sam's restaurant had always used. The questioning escalated as Sam demanded specifics about Williams's barbecue dining experiences throughout Houston, pressing for detailed comparisons between his sauce and competitors' offerings. Williams attempted to diffuse the increasingly uncomfortable situation by emphasizing that he simply needed to control sauce portions for health reasons, rather than making quality judgments between different restaurants. Derek kept trying to explain that it wasn't about the food quality, it was about his medical needs, Chang recalled. But Sam wasn't listening to the health aspect. He was fixated on the idea that Derek was comparing his restaurant unfavorably to other places. The conversation was going in circles with Derek explaining his condition and Sam demanding to know which restaurants he thought were better. Other customers began noticing the escalating tension as Sam's voice rose and his questioning became more aggressive. The comfortable atmosphere that had characterized the early evening evaporated as diners recognized that they were witnessing something far more serious than a simple service disagreement between a customer and restaurant owner. "You could feel the whole room getting uncomfortable," remembers Patricia Jenkins. Sam was leaning over Derek's table, talking fast and gesturing with his hands, asking the same questions over and over again. Derek looked confused and a little scared. He clearly hadn't expected his simple request to trigger such an intense reaction. The situation deteriorated further when Williams attempted to end the conversation by saying he would accept sauce as normally served rather than continuing to discuss accommodation options that were clearly causing distress for the restaurant owner. Sam interpreted this withdrawal as confirmation that Williams was dissatisfied with the service and would likely share negative opinions about the restaurant with other potential customers. When Derek said he would just take the regular sauce application, Sam accused him of being passive-aggressive and dishonest about his real opinion of the food, Chang testified. Sam started saying that Derek was planning to complain about the restaurant to other people, that he was the type of customer who pretended to be satisfied in person but then spread negative comments throughout the community. The accusations continued as Sam's paranoid interpretation of Williams's behavior expanded into elaborate theories about customer deception and reputation sabotage. He suggested that Williams was part of a pattern of customers who visited his restaurant specifically to gather information for negative comparisons with competing establishments, that his sauce on the side request was a deliberate attempt to undermine traditional barbecue service methods. Sam was constructing this whole conspiracy theory about Derek based on absolutely nothing, Chang later explained to investigators. Derek was just a guy trying to manage his blood pressure who happened to make an innocent comment about other restaurants. But Sam had turned him into some kind of enemy agent working to destroy authentic barbecue culture. Williams's attempts to reassure Sam that he genuinely enjoyed the restaurant and had no intention of sharing negative opinions were interpreted as further evidence of deception. Sam demanded that Williams explain exactly what he planned to tell other people about his dining experience, what aspects of the service he would criticize, and whether he was working with food bloggers or critics to gather information for published reviews. Derek was getting really uncomfortable with the interrogation, Chang recalled. He kept saying that he wasn't planning to tell anyone anything negative, that he just wanted to eat his dinner and go home. But Sam was convinced that Derek was lying and would spread damaging opinions about the restaurant throughout the neighborhood. The confrontation expanded to include accusations about Williams's dining companions, with Sam suggesting that Chang was recording their conversation for later analysis or documentation. When Chang attempted to defend herself by explaining that she was simply trying to enjoy dinner with a friend, Sam accused her of coordinating with Williams to conduct systematic evaluation of his restaurant's service procedures. Sam was seeing conspiracies everywhere, Chang testified. When I tried to calm him down by saying we were just regular customers having dinner, he accused me of being part of Derek's plan to evaluate the restaurant. He was convinced that we were working together to gather information that would be used to damage his reputation. Other diners began leaving their tables as the confrontation consumed the restaurant's atmosphere and made normal dining impossible. Janet Morris attempted to intervene by suggesting that the misunderstanding could be resolved through calm conversation. But Sam accused her of undermining his authority by taking customers' sides against management decisions. Janet was trying to help, but Sam turned on her like she was betraying him, Patricia Jenkins later recalled. He started yelling at her for not supporting his efforts to maintain quality standards, for enabling customers who were trying to change traditional service methods. The man was completely out of control. The situation reached a critical escalation point when Williams stood up to leave, rather than continue participating in a confrontation that had spiraled far beyond any rational discussion of source service preferences. Sam interpreted the departure attempt as confirmation that Williams had achieved his goal of disrupting the restaurant and gathering negative information for later dissemination. When Derek tried to leave, Sam blocked his path and demanded that he explain his real motivations for visiting the restaurant, Chang testified. Sam was convinced that Derek's entire visit had been planned as some kind of intelligence-gathering mission against authentic barbecue culture. He wouldn't let Derek leave until he admitted what information he was planning to share with competitors or food critics. The physical confrontation began when Williams attempted to move past Sam toward the restaurant's exit, triggering accusations that he was trying to escape, before explaining his deceptive behavior to other customers who deserved to understand the threat that critics posed to traditional barbecue establishments. Sam's blocking behavior escalated into physical restraint as he grabbed Williams's arm to prevent his departure. That's when everything changed, Chang later explained to investigators. Sam wasn't just arguing anymore. He was physically preventing Derek from leaving the restaurant. Derek was saying, "Let me go," and trying to pull away, but Sam was holding his arm and demanding answers to questions that didn't make any sense. The physical struggle intensified as Williams attempted to break free from Sam's grip, while other customers realized that they were witnessing a situation that had escalated far beyond normal dispute resolution. Some diners attempted to call for police assistance, but the restaurant's isolated location and limited cell phone coverage in 1996 made immediate communication with emergency services difficult. People were trying to call 911, but the phones weren't working properly, Patricia Jenkins recalled. Some customers ran outside to flag down passing cars or find a working phone booth. We knew that Sam was having some kind of breakdown and that Derek was in real danger, but we couldn't get help fast enough. Janet Morris made desperate attempts to de-escalate the situation by appealing to Sam's rationality and reminding him of his reputation as a respected community leader who had always treated customers with kindness and respect. Her intervention was met with accusations that she was collaborating with Williams to undermine his restaurant's traditional service standards. "I kept telling Sam that Derek was just a regular customer with a health condition, that there was no conspiracy against the restaurant," Morris later testified. But Sam was beyond reasoning with. He was convinced that everyone was lying to him and that customers like Derek were part of an organized effort to destroy authentic barbecue culture. The confrontation continued for nearly 20 minutes as Sam's paranoid delusions expanded to encompass every person in the restaurant, transforming customers and employees into perceived enemies who were collaborating to sabotage his life's work. The man who had once welcomed diverse opinions and friendly conversation had become someone who viewed any deviation from his expectations as evidence of betrayal and deception. Emergency responders later determined that Sam's mental state during this period showed signs of acute paranoid psychosis, triggered by months of accumulated stress, social isolation, and perfectionist anxiety that had overwhelmed his ability to interpret normal social interactions rationally. The combination of sleep deprivation, nutritional deficiency, and obsessive behavior had created conditions where minor disagreements could trigger catastrophic emotional responses. Sam was experiencing a complete break from reality, explains Dr. Patricia Williams, who consulted on the psychological aspects of the case. His paranoid delusions had reached the point where he genuinely believed that casual customer interactions were elaborate plots designed to destroy his restaurant and reputation. In that mental state, he was responding to threats that existed only in his distorted perception of reality. The tragic climax occurred when Sam's desperate need to prevent perceived enemies from escaping with damaging information about his restaurant led him to take actions that would forever end the lives of 9 innocent people who had simply chosen the wrong evening to dine at a neighborhood establishment they had patronized for years. The specific details of those final moments remain sealed in court records, but survivors and investigators agree that Sam's actions were driven by paranoid delusions rather than calculated malice. Sam wasn't evil. He was sick, Chang later reflected during victim impact statements. He was a good man who got overwhelmed by pressures he couldn't handle and lost touch with reality in a way that turned innocent customers into perceived enemies. Understanding that doesn't excuse what happened, but it helps explain how someone who had been a positive community presence for 12 years could become capable of such devastating actions. The immediate aftermath involved extensive emergency response efforts as first responders worked to secure the scene, provide medical assistance to survivors, and begin the complex investigation that would eventually reveal the psychological factors underlying Sam's breakdown. The Fifth Ward community struggled to comprehend how their beloved neighborhood pitmaster had become responsible for a tragedy that claimed 9 lives and forever changed the character of a close-knit community. The hardest part was reconciling the Sam we had known with the person who committed these acts, Reverend Charles Mitchell later explained. For 12 years, he had been a positive presence in our community, someone who brought people together through food and hospitality. The mental illness that consumed him didn't erase those years of genuine service, but it made it impossible to separate the tragedy from our memories of better times. The investigation revealed extensive documentation of Sam's deteriorating mental state throughout 1996, including medical records showing elevated stress levels, employee testimonies about increasingly erratic behavior, and customer complaints about aggressive interactions that had escalated throughout the months preceding the tragedy. Mental health professionals concluded that Sam's breakdown represented a preventable crisis that might have been averted through early intervention and appropriate treatment. There were warning signs throughout the year that Sam was struggling with mental health issues, Dr. Eugene Parker later testified. His family and community recognized that something was wrong, but in 1996 we didn't have the same understanding of mental health crises or the resources to provide adequate intervention. Sam fell through gaps in our support systems and reached a breaking point that might have been prevented with proper professional help. The legal proceedings that followed involved extensive psychiatric evaluation of Sam's mental state during the months leading to the tragedy and at the time of the incidents. Defense attorneys argued that Sam's actions were the result of severe mental illness that had impaired his ability to distinguish between reality and paranoid delusions, while prosecutors maintained that he retained sufficient awareness to be held accountable for his choices. The trial revealed the depth of Sam's psychological deterioration through testimony from family members, employees, customers, and mental health professionals who painted a portrait of a man whose identity had become so completely fused with his restaurant's success that any perceived threat to his reputation triggered defensive responses that escalated beyond all rational proportion. Sam's sense of self-worth had become entirely dependent on external validation through his restaurant's success, testified forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Foster. When that validation seemed threatened by customer criticism or competitive pressure, he experienced it as a threat to his very existence, rather than normal business challenges. His paranoid interpretation of customer interactions reflected his desperate need to protect an identity that felt constantly under attack. The community impact of the tragedy extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, affecting the entire Fifth Ward's sense of safety and trust in ways that persisted for years after the events. Local businesses experienced decreased foot traffic as residents became wary of social gathering places that had previously been considered safe community spaces. People were afraid to eat out for months afterward, explains community leader Angela Martinez. The idea that a neighborhood restaurant owner could suddenly become dangerous made everyone question their assumptions about safety in familiar places. Restaurants that had been community gathering spots for generations suddenly felt potentially threatening rather than welcoming. The tragedy also sparked broader conversations about mental health awareness and support systems within African American communities, where seeking professional psychological help carried cultural stigma that often prevented early intervention for individuals experiencing crisis situations. Community leaders recognized that Sam's breakdown might have been prevented through better understanding of warning signs and more accessible mental health resources. Sam's case became a wake-up call about mental health in our community, Reverend Mitchell later reflected. We realized that our traditional approaches to supporting troubled community members weren't adequate for addressing serious psychological crises. The tragedy motivated us to develop better systems for recognizing warning signs and connecting people with professional help before situations escalate beyond community intervention capabilities. The restaurant building itself became a permanent reminder of the tragedy, remaining vacant for several years before being demolished and converted into a community memorial garden that honors both the victims and Sam's positive contributions to the neighborhood during his 12 years of normal operation. The memorial design reflects the community's complex relationship with the tragedy, acknowledging loss while celebrating the healing power of shared remembrance. We didn't want to erase Sam's positive legacy or forget the good times people experienced at his restaurant, explains Memorial Committee member Dorothy Hayes, but we also needed to honor the victims and provide a space for healing. The garden represents our community's ability to find hope and renewal even in the aftermath of devastating tragedy. The long-term impact on survivors included extensive therapy and counseling to address trauma symptoms that persisted for years after the events. Many required ongoing psychological support to process their experiences and rebuild their sense of safety in social situations that had previously been sources of joy and community connection. Recovering from that night was a process that took years, Chang later explained. I had to work through survivors' guilt, anxiety about eating in restaurants, and the constant replay of events that I couldn't change or understand. Professional counseling helped me recognize that Sam's actions were the result of mental illness, rather than something I could have predicted or prevented. The tragedy ultimately served as a catalyst for improved mental health awareness and support systems throughout the Houston area, with Sam's case being studied by professionals seeking to understand how community-based intervention might prevent similar breakdowns in the future. His story became part of training programs for restaurant industry professionals, community leaders, and mental health workers who needed to recognize warning signs of psychological crisis. Sam's breakdown taught us that mental illness can affect anyone, regardless of their previous reputation or community standing, Dr. Williams concluded. The warning signs were visible to people who knew him, but we lacked the knowledge and resources to provide effective intervention. His tragedy became a learning opportunity that has helped prevent similar situations through better understanding of psychological crisis, recognition, and response. The legacy of September 23, 1996, remains a complex blend of loss, learning, and community resilience that continues to influence Fifth Ward culture more than 25 years after the events. While the specific details of that evening can never be forgotten or fully explained, the community's response demonstrated the human capacity for healing, understanding, and positive change even in the aftermath of incomprehensible tragedy.